I am here today to talk to you of all things about the prophecy of the popes and that process by which, that medieval process by which the cardinals go there to St. Peter's Square, sequester themselves into the Sistine Chapel, and they go through that very ancient ritual of electing a pope. A whole lot of you may not even know what I'm talking about with the prophecy of the Pope. In 1139, a priest by the name of Malachy, an Irish bishop, very popular, he served in an area that was called Armagh, which is now known as Northern Ireland. This was a priest who was accredited with having the gift of healing and also having the gift of prophecy. But in 1139, he is summoned to Rome by the then Pope, Pope Innocent II. And like every priest in his day, of course, you know, he wanted to go to Rome. He wanted to see the Vatican City. He dreamed of meeting the Pope. And so he gets together his entourage and their beasts of burden and their carts and all of that. And they begin this 9-month arduous journey across Europe. And as they're going, they see the conditions of the world. The pain, the suffering, the plagues of the 11th century that are devastating so many townships and people, the wantonness, the hunger. And all of this is weighing really heavy on Malachy's mind. He was already a priest of the people anyway. And then 9 months later, now it's 1140, and he arrives in the Vatican City. And he is put off immediately by what he finds there. This is a time, by the way, in history that is known as the pornocracy. It was a time where the Pope and those around him and the Vatican, they embellished all of this privilege and finery and wine and pomp and circumstance and food and all of the splendor. And Malachy comes riding in with his donkey pulling some cart, and he has just seen what's going on across the then known world, and he is really offset by what he finds there. So he conducts his business with Innocent II and gives an update on his diocese, and then he can't wait to get out of the city. And this is where things get interesting. Because according to history and tradition, as Malachy is coming up out of the Seven Hill City, all of a sudden something happens to him. First of all, he utters one line in Latin that is essentially a judgment upon the papacy. And the flavor of this judgment is that God is only going to allow this to go so long. That then is followed by a series of 112 lines that he writes down in Latin, each one of these symbolic of each pope that would arrive in succession, with the Pope following Innocent II, which is Celestine II, all the way down to the final Pope, and that is the Pope, he says, line number 112, that is the Pope that will reside in Rome when the church and the world enter into the Great Tribulation period, ending with the destruction of Rome and the return of what he calls the great and terrible judge, that is Jesus Christ, who's going to judge his people, including this religious system that he had found at that moment to be so offensive. Bottom line this, it remained in the Vatican archives, the prophecy did, for about 400 years. We don't even know how it got into the Vatican archives, but somehow it did. And it was hidden there like so many other things have been hidden inside those secret archives. You know, the Vatican, they basically wrote the rules for Central Intelligence and the FBI. Much of what they developed in terms of concealing documentation is what we adopted into our intelligence agencies later on. But in 1595, a Benedictine historian by the name of Arnold de Wyan publishes the Prophecy of the Popes. He takes it out of the archives, puts it in his 1,700-page book, Lignum Vitae, and it comes out, and it's now in the public forum. And here is the mystery. From that day and forward, the prophecy of the popes actually has seemed to increase in terms of its accuracy. If it had been a fraud concocted in 1590s, then you would expect that from that time forward, now that we can watch it, it would fall apart, but it hasn't. It's actually become more accurate, and this has implied something. It has implied to some people that the prophecy of the popes was either, one, divinely inspired, or number two, demonically inspired, and it is some part of a great deception. Or number three, and this is the one that I tend to kind of lean toward 60-40, is that for whatever reason this document has held a place of importance in the mind of the cardinal electors. And they have only been electing popes that could be seen in one way or another as fulfilling their line in the prophecy, and therefore it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, whether or not it was ever originally given by God or the devil. For instance, take just the last three popes as an example. Pope number 110, his line in the prophecy was de laboris solis, or from the Latin to the English, he will come through the labor of the sun. And this was the line for Pope John Paul II, who was born during a partial solar eclipse, and then years later actually died and was buried through a very rare hybrid eclipse. And so he literally entered the world and exited the world through the labor of the sun. Then came line number 111, Gloria Olivae. This was the line for Benedict, and this was the one that says he will be the glory of the olives. And this was interesting because in the lead up to the election of Benedict, there were a lot of the watchers of the prophecy, right? They were saying this guy is going to be a Benedictine priest because their symbol is the olive branch and their priests are known as the Olivetans. Therefore, the glory of the olives, he's going to be a Benedictine priest. Well, then the conclave came and they elected a German cardinal by the name of Ratzinger, who was not a Benedictine, and everybody was thinking, uh-oh, something just suddenly really fell apart in the prophecy of the popes. Then, a few hours later, Benedict walks out there into the well where the Pope stands in St. Peter's Square, and he announces two things. Number one, that he had been born on the feast day of St. Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine order. And secondly, that he was taking, therefore, as his name, Benedict XVI, in an astonishing fulfillment of this line number 111 of the prophecy of the popes. But it also, of course, indicates he may have selected that name because what? Some kind of backroom deal. You have to make yourself to appear to be a fulfillment of the prophecy. I don't know, but it does bring us then to the final line, line number 112, which is the line for Pope Francis I, and the question, does George Bergoglio fulfill the final line in the prophecy? And here is what the prophecy says. This is the most expressive line in the prophecy of the popes, and it says this: in the extreme persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep in many tribulations, and when those things are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The end. That is the final line in the prophecy, a 900-year-old prophecy, and it is the line for Pope Francis. Now the question then is, does Bergoglio fulfill this line? First of all, part of it we're going to have to wait and see, Because if he is the Pope residing at the Vatican, as the Great Tribulation unfolds around us, we're all going to know that in a very short period of time, I suspect. But the second thing was this line, Peter the Roman. Because of that line, some of the people who were watching the prophecy, not the scholars who always had a different view on this, but many of the people in the public, they thought, okay, it's got to be a guy, right, who's going to have some part of his name is Peter. And if he's an Italian, or in the old language, a Roman, we're going to literally have a guy named Peter the Roman who becomes the next pope. And so people were watching that. They thought the current Secretary of State, Tarcisio Pietro Peter Bertone, who was an Italian, they thought, wow, if he becomes the Pope, I mean, run for the hills, right? Start crying for the rocks to fall on us because the man is here. And people were excited about it. The prophecy never did pick a person's Christian name or a name that they were born with. In other words, John Paul II was not born De Labora Solis. Benedict was not born Gloria Olivae. The lines in the prophecy always tell us something about the character of the Pope, how he wants to model his pastorship or his papacy in Rome. And for that reason, many Catholic scholars especially had always said the final Pope will not have the name Peter. The title Peter the Roman is symbolic. So many Catholic scholars believe that this is simply talking about the consummation of the office, the final line, the final Peter, if you will. But then the term the Roman becomes really interested. Catholic scholars wrote as many as decades ago that what it actually implies is that this will be a guy who will refascinate the world with the office of the papacy, who will refascinate the world with Roman Catholicism. And folks, if this guy has done anything, it has fascinated the world with the office of the Pope. Having said that, it's spooky how Bergoglio has gone out of his way to attach himself to the literal title, Peter the Roman, and to wrap himself in the final line of that language. But Francis was born Giovanni and later changed his name to Francesco di Pietro Peter de Bernardone, and as an Italian his name literally translates Peter the Roman. Know this, Pope Francis is selling himself as a humble man, and he may be a humble man, but that does not mean he is an ignorant man. He is a Jesuit. He has advanced degrees in science, in history. He is very familiar that he is the final line in the prophecy of the popes. He knows that. He also knows, however, that Francis of Assisi was a mystic like Malachy Morgare. In fact, Francis of Assisi only lived 50 years after the prophecy of the popes was given. There's some evidence he was familiar with it, but even if he wasn't, Francis of Assisi prophesied too about the final pope. And do you want to know what he said about the final pope? Here's an excerpt from his prophecy. He says he will be raised to the pontificate, who by his cunning will endeavor to draw many into error and death. For in those days, Jesus Christ will send them not a true pastor, but a destroyer. Why in the world would Bergoglio name himself after a guy whose name means Peter the Roman and whose prophecy implies the very last line, 112, that this guy will be a deceiver who is going to lead the world into destruction? Those who have paid attention to this history, you are familiar that in the background of Catholicism, some of the ancient prophecies, more than one, foresaw the end times. And what did they see? They saw that something is going to happen to the rightful pope. that he is going to die or be killed. Another says maybe he's going to be arrested. But something happens that moves the Pope out of office, and then an anti-pope rises up under him, and that guy is the one that's really the bad one. The Vatican, folks, is not like any other Christian denomination. There are 90 ambassadors at any time parked there at the Vatican City. It has relationships, political and otherwise, with most of the major nations around the world. And Jesuits wanted to seize control of the Vatican. For what purpose? They want to use it as a machine that will give assistance to the rise of the new world order. And furthermore, they want to use it, they want to work in tandem with the coming of the Antichrist for the implementation of the objectives of the Antichrist. Again, it goes back to, I think they have a deal with somebody. I think the Bible has some intriguing things to say about all this too. Very quickly, the Antichrist will appear with all lying signs and wonders, 2 Thessalonians 2:9. Secondly, his coming will be marked by fearful sights and great signs from heaven, Luke 21:11. Also, don't forget the Bible tells us that men's heart will fail them for fear, for seeing those things that are coming upon the earth. Thirdly, the Antichrist and false prophet will be aligned with the powers of the air and able to call down fire from heaven. Fourthly, and this is one of the more intriguing ones, is Daniel, who says that the Antichrist will champion worship of a strange alien god. Daniel 11:38 through 39, in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange god, an alien god. Well, as a result of these verses and ongoing investigation into Petrus Romanus and Ex Vaticana, I have come to suspect one thing and to believe three others. Number one, I suspect that a form of great deception is at our doorstep, and the world's most politically powerful church seems to be playing into the hands of evil supernaturalism. It is obvious now that the Vatican is preparing for, even perhaps monitoring from Mount Graham, the approaching of an alien savior. I suspect that. But I believe that much of the UFO and especially alien abduction phenomenon is demonic, part of a great setup, the likes of which the world is unprepared for, and that could overwhelm the average person's senses in the not too distant future. Number three, but great deception is coming. And ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. Somebody say amen. Amen. And finally, I believe the entire world is soon going to witness the power of Christ over the deceptive ones, as it describes a near future seen in Revelation 9:11-21. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes was a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood. And his name is called the Word of God.
Amen. These are the WTF Files. Subscribe today and be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Thank you for watching the WTF Files.